Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking about 3 recent accidents, all of which should have been avoidable. Interestingly, 2 of them involve helicopters, and yet the lessons we can learn from them apply directly to fixed-wing pilots as well. 2 of the 3 accidents involve failure to follow standard operating procedures, and 2 of them appear to include spatial disorientation. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, go to whatever app that you're using to listen to me now. Take a moment and right now touch either the subscribe or follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've been listening for a while and have learned new things from the show, I'd like to invite you to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. For example, listeners who sign up at the $20 a month level can view the many videos I've posted online. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to sign up, and when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. Now, if this episode sounds slightly different, it's because I'm recording it at my home away from home, which is the Knoxville Airport Hilton. And these people really know pilots because they always try to give us rooms that face outside toward the Cirrus facility that's just a few hundred feet away. As I'm sitting in my room here on a Sunday, I count about 30 Cirrus aircraft sitting on their ramp, many of which are scheduled for delivery to new owners soon. And tomorrow, I'll start a week-long trip in which I'll be giving somewhere between 30 and 40 hours of flight instruction in a Vision jet. Now, when you figure many of the legs will be 2.5 hours or less, that's a lot of segments. So it's going to be important that the new jet owner and I don't get fatigued, which would be easy to do with the ambitious plan he's come up for our time together. Now, when we think of fatigue, we generally think of being tired. But there's another kind of fatigue that we might more generally call complacency. And this can occur from doing the same thing over and over again, such as running a checklist many, many times. And yet as pilots, it's important that we not become complacent and that we continue to carefully run these checklists every single time we fly an airplane. So that's certainly something I'll be thinking about this week, and it directly relates to 2 of the 3 accidents we'll talk about today. Let's talk first about standard operating procedures, or SOPs, why they're important, and why pilots sometimes don't follow them. I recently received an email from Captain Sully Sullenberger, who is, of course, one of the pilots who landed an airliner on the Hudson River next to New York City after the plane encountered geese and both engines failed. In the email, Sully said that we may be becoming victims of our own success. Just because there has not been a fatal major airline accident in the U.S. since 2009 does not mean that we're doing everything right or as well as we should in terms of safety. He wrote, "As I've been saying for years, we can no longer define safety as the absence of accidents. We must proactively be making air travel safer and remind ourselves that we cannot become complacent." Now, I thought his comment about absence of accidents was interesting. Since we now have virtually 0 airliner accidents in the U.S., accident analysis is not a helpful way for us to continue to improve aviation safety, at least in airliners. And even in general aviation, where we still have lots of accidents, simply reading about and understanding accidents is in itself not sufficient for improving safety and eliminating all accidents. When we have few accidents to guide us in making aviation safer, it becomes all the more important to develop and follow standard operating procedures. Now, if you fly charter or work for an airline, then the company has provided you with those procedures and you're expected to follow them. But for those of us who are not working in Part 135 or 121 operations, we need to develop our own robust procedures and we need to train ourselves to follow them every single time we fly. But unfortunately, it's easy to rationalize not following our procedures or to become fatigued from performing them so many times that they become boring and we become complacent about following them every time we fly. There's also another potential trap. As you and I become more experienced, there's a risk that we might develop the belief that we've become so competent and proficient that we don't need to follow all of the procedures every time, and that some of those procedures are for, well, less experienced pilots. I remember years ago teaching a student pilot his private, and then giving him his first flight lesson for the instrument rating. As we sat in the cockpit, this brand new private pilot put the checklist aside and said, "I guess we won't be needing this anymore." I didn't say anything at the time, as I wanted to see how this would play out. He started the airplane from memory and was getting ready to taxi when I pointed out that he had never fastened his seatbelt. He learned a lesson that day, and I think it was far more powerful than if I'd simply said, no, you need to use the checklist every time you fly. To highlight the need to follow SOPs, including checklists every time we fly, let's talk first about a Robinson R44 helicopter accident that occurred in 2021 in Texas. Fortunately, in this accident, everyone walked away uninjured, though the helicopter was heavily damaged and the pilot's ego was probably bruised. But hopefully he learned a lesson and will be more diligent about following procedures in the future. Unlike many accidents, there is a video available, taken by one of the passengers, which shows exactly what happened, and it shows the pilot's "oh, shucks" moment immediately after the crash when he realized what he did wrong. Now, the following comes directly from the NTSB final report. It says, the pilot reported that it was the second flight of the day. After an uneventful first flight, the helicopter returned to the airport to refuel and pick up new passengers. The purpose of the flight was to hunt game. As the passengers were getting into the helicopter, a rifle was dropped on the dash of the helicopter, which turned the alternator switch, master switch, and clutch switch to off. The pilot immediately turned the switches back on and conducted a hover power and final systems check. The helicopter then took off uneventfully. About 120 feet above the ground, the engine sputtered once, then lost complete power. The pilot performed a left-turning auto rotation to a field. During the descent, the pilot increased the throttle, but the engine did not respond. The helicopter impacted trees before it landed hard on a small mound of dirt and came to rest nose low. During the impact sequence, the main rotor blade contacted and severed the tail boom, in other words, cut off the tail of the helicopter. The pilot never reported that he conducted the starting engine and run-up checklist before taking off. This was confirmed by an onboard video. And I'll tell you in a moment how skipping these checklists led to this crash. Now, continuing on, it says the pilot was a 31-year-old male with a commercial helicopter certificate. The pilot had 4,954 hours of total time. He had 3,000 hours in Robinson R44 helicopters, the make and model of the accident aircraft. In the prior 90 days, he'd flown 100 hours, and in the prior 30 days, he'd flown 25 hours. So arguably, this pilot was very experienced in the helicopter, and he was current, having flown about an hour a day for the preceding 3 months. But that high level of experience can also lead to complacency. When you fly a lot, it's easy to believe that you know your aircraft so well and that you are so competent a pilot that you can skip some of the standard procedures, particularly if you rationalize that these procedures are for lesser experienced pilots. Okay, here's the key to what happened. Again, reading from the report. Video of the accident flight begins with a helicopter on the ramp, with the engine running with a magneto key in what appears to be the off position. In addition, as the pilot shuts down the helicopter after impact, the position of the key did not appear to move despite his finger touching the key. Now, by the way, I first became aware of this accident when I came across that video on YouTube. In it, as the pilot is shutting everything off, he tries to turn the mag key off, but it won't turn off as it's already in the off position. The pilot then turns toward the camera with what appears to be a sheepish grin as he realizes his mistake. Now, if you're wondering, how could it be that the helicopter's engine was running with a mag key in the off position? Let me refer you to episode 13, in which I describe the operation of magnetos, the operation of the mag key, and how such a failure could happen. To review briefly, most aircraft have two magnetos, and to turn them off, a wire is connected to ground, and the grounding occurs through the mag switch. And if one of those wires becomes broken, you have what's referred to as a hot prop, which means that one or both of the magnetos can still work, even when the key is in the off position. When you do a magneto check during the run-up, you turn the key from the both position to the L and the R positions, and you're checking to see how much the RPM drops when you do that. But what you may not realize is that if you get no RPM drop at all when you turn to the L or R positions, that means that one of the ground wires, also called a P-lead, has become disconnected. So for example, if the P-lead to one of the magnetos is broken or has become disconnected, you might be able to start the engine with the mag key in the off position, though you'd still be operating on just one magneto. Now here's more from the NTSB report. It says, During a post-accident examination of the airframe and engine, the helicopter was prepped for an engine run. It started normally and idled for a short time. Then a magneto check was conducted. The engine RPM decreased when the key was turned to the left magneto position. However, the RPM remained the same when the right magneto was selected. The key was then moved to the off position, and the engine continued to run. The key was jiggled, manipulated, and even removed from the ignition switch, but the engine continued to run. So it turns out that by not correctly following the startup checklist, the pilot missed 2 opportunities to discover his error. In the Robinson R44 pilot operating helicopter handbook, the starting engine and run-up checklist includes, quote, ignition switch, prime, then both, and mag drop at 75% RPM, 7% max in 2 seconds. Both checklist items involve manipulating the key prior to takeoff. And here's a minor deficiency in the R44 POH. It tells pilots to look for a 7% max drop in RPM in 2 seconds, but it doesn't tell them that there has to be some RPM drop to pass the check. So a pilot following this checklist might conclude that when doing the mag check, that a drop of 0 in the RPM would be acceptable during the check, which it's less than 70%, but it wouldn't be acceptable because a drop of 0 indicates a broken P-lead. The NTSB probable cause, the pilot's inadequate pre-takeoff checks, which resulted in the magneto switch remaining in the off position during the takeoff sequence and initial climb, and the right magneto grounding intermittently. So apparently that ground wire was loose, but sometime after takeoff, it reconnected itself, and since the key was in the off position, the engine quit. As long as we're talking about helicopter accidents, let's talk about the crash of another Robinson R44 that occurred recently near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The NTSB prelim report for that accident is out, and it has the hallmarks of a spatial disorientation accident. I'll read a portion of the report, and afterwards I'll tell you something about the R44 that may come as a surprise to most fixed-wing pilots. On March 26, 2023, at about 2:38 a.m., a Robinson R44-2 helicopter, November 441 Papa Delta, was destroyed when it was involved in an accident near Port Allen, Louisiana. The pilot and tactical flight officer sustained fatal injuries. The Baton Rouge Police Department helicopter, call sign Air 1, departed the Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport, BTR, about 2:26 a.m. to provide aerial support to ground units that were conducting a high-speed pursuit of a fleeing vehicle. Air 1 advised dispatch and ground units via radio that they were assisting and requested updates to the vehicle movement and location. ADSB data showed the helicopter depart BTR to the south, turn west, then overfly Highway 190 west of Baton Rouge. Unable to maintain a safe pursuit of the vehicle, BRPD terminated the pursuit to all BRPD units, including the helicopter, via radio at 2:35 a.m. There were no further communications received from the helicopter. About that time, the data showed the helicopter execute a shallow left deviation to the south of Highway 190. Following the deviation, a left turn initiated, and the turn rate increased, followed by a series of turns and altitude changes. The ADSB data ended at 2:38 a.m. at an altitude of about 1,450 feet above ground. There were no witnesses to the accident. Now, when the pursuit was called off, this helicopter was about 9 miles west of the Baton Rouge airport, over farm fields with most likely no lights below. It was also within 2 miles of the banks of the Mississippi River. I've looked at the FlightAware data for the crash, and initially the helicopter was flying along the highway at 400 feet while it was in pursuit. When the helicopter began to return to base, it made a climbing 180-degree left turn to 700 feet. It then made a 90-degree right turn while maintaining 700 feet, and then it made a 180-degree right turn, which would take it back to the highway, and then began to climb again, reaching 1,450 feet. It continued on that heading, crossed the highway, and soon after entered an extremely tight 360-degree turn and crashed. Now, here are the METARs from the Baton Rouge airport, which is 9 miles east of the crash site. At 11:53 p.m., the sky was clear. At 12:49 a.m., it was broken at 1,200 feet. At 1:53 a.m., it was overcast at 1,000. And at 2:37 a.m., a minute before the helicopter crashed, it was overcast at 900. So it seems apparent that the helicopter climbed up into an overcast, became spatially disoriented, and crashed. And here's something that may come as a surprise to fixed-wing pilots. I recently took a couple of flight lessons for the fun of it in a Robinson R44 Cadet helicopter. The Cadet is a two-seat version of the R44 that's less expensive to rent, which makes it ideal for training. And what I was surprised to discover when I took those lessons is that not only do most Robinson helicopters not have autopilots, but some of them, including the R44 Cadet that I flew, have no gyro instruments at all. So there's no attitude indicator, there's no heading indicator, and there's no turn coordinator. And if you're thinking, wow, this must have been a really old helicopter, it's not. It was a 2019 model, so it's just 4 years old. Now, it's likely that the accident R44 was better equipped and did include at least an attitude indicator, though possibly not the other gyros. But flying a helicopter after inadvertently going IMC is very difficult, even for high-time helicopter pilots, as illustrated by the Kobe Bryant helicopter crash that we discussed in episodes 161 and 177. So you might be wondering, how in dark night conditions can a pilot safely fly VFR in a helicopter without all three gyro instruments? The answer is you can't. In fact, the POHs for both the R44 and the R44 Cadet have a rather interesting limitation that addresses this issue. In the limitations section, section 2, it says, and I'm including the grammatical error, quote, VFR operations at night is permitted only when landing, navigation, instrument, and anti-collision lights are operational. Orientation during night flight must be maintained by visual reference to ground objects illuminated solely by lights on the ground or adequate celestial illumination. What that means is that if there aren't lights on the ground, for example, if you're flying over farm fields, as this accident pilot was, with few or no lights on the ground, then you must have some light coming from the sky, which from a practical standpoint means there must be some moonlight available, or I guess theoretically if the sky were clear and you could see the stars, that might be sufficient, but probably just barely. And if you're wondering about the moon, I looked up a lunar table for Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On that date, there was a quarter moon. However, it had set more than 2 hours before the accident, so there was no moonlight available to help the pilot. In the case of this accident, the helicopter pilot was initially following a highway at 400 feet, and cars on the road may have provided sufficient ground lighting. However, when he started a series of turns to return to base, he would have had fewer ground lights available. Had the skies been clear and some moonlight been available, he would probably have been fine. Now, we'll never know for sure why the pilot chose to climb, but perhaps it was because there were low clouds and fog over the fields and near the river. I remember once flying at night into King City Airport, that's KIC, which is surrounded by farm fields on 3 sides. And after passing the numbers on the downwind, we were immediately in inky blackness with no lights outside. Worse, since the farm fields were irrigated and damp, there was more moisture in the air and visibility was less than it had been abeam the airport on downwind. Now, in this accident, the pilot may have been stuck between a rock and a hard place. If he was encountering low-level clouds and ground fog, it may have made sense to climb, but with an overcast layer at about 1,000 feet, that also wasn't a good option. Now, one benefit a helicopter has over an airplane is that it can land most anywhere. And in a situation like this, if the helicopter had any ground contact whatsoever, he might have been better off landing, even if it would have meant spending the night in a farm field. And now let's talk about our third accident, which occurred in early April in Jessup, Georgia. It involved a 2003 Cirrus SR-22, and unfortunately it was fatal and killed the pilot. You may have heard about it in the news, as the pilot was a former member of SEAL Team 6. He later became a chiropractor, and apparently flew frequently between 2 cities about 60 miles apart. The following comes from the preliminary NTSB report. On April 6, 2023, about 7:50 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the Cirrus Design Corporation SR-22, November 911 Tango Kilo, was substantially damaged when it was involved in an accident near Jessup, Georgia. The private pilot was fatally injured. According to initial ADSB data, the airplane departed from Fernandina Beach Municipal Airport, that's FHB, Fernandina Beach, Florida, about 7:28 a.m. and proceeded to the north-northwest at 1,700 feet MSL toward Jessup Wayne County Airport, JES in Jessup, Georgia. The pilot did not request any air traffic control services during the flight. At 7:46 a.m., he initiated a descent, eventually crossing the JES airport boundary from the south at 225 feet MSL on a perpendicular ground track to runway 29. While crossing the runway, the aircraft was observed in a slight climb before ADS-B data was lost. The airplane impacted level terrain about 1,200 feet from the runway 29 threshold near the approach lighting system. The wreckage came to rest upright and there was no fire. The wing flaps actuator was found in the retracted up position. The aircraft was equipped with a Cirrus airframe parachute cap system. The system had not activated and the parachute was not deployed. The cap safety pin was found in place in the cap's handle holder, which, by the way, means it had not been removed. The airport was equipped with an AWOS, and the 7:50 a.m. observation included 1/4 mile visibility in fog, calm wind, and a ceiling of 300 feet. Airport personnel who arrived to work about 5 minutes after the accident reported and documented fog on the ramp at the time of their arrival. The pilot held a private pilot certificate with ratings for airplane single-engine land and instrument airplane and was the owner of the airplane. There was a published RNAV GPS approach to runway 29. However, the airplane's ADS-B flight track was not consistent with that instrument approach procedure. The airplane was equipped with MFD and PFD flight displays. The non-volatile memory from those units were forwarded to the NTSB Vehicle Recorders Laboratory for examination and download of the data. Now, from what we know about this accident, we can see at least two standard operating procedures that the accident pilot didn't perform correctly. The first is that the safety pin had not been removed from the cap's parachute handle holder. Removing that pin is so important that Cirrus includes it in two checklists, the pre-flight checklist and the before takeoff checklist. So if this pilot was using his checklist, he missed that item twice. It's also possible that the pilot was in the habit of not removing the safety pin. Interestingly, there have been other Cirrus accidents in the past in which the pin was still in place in the aircraft wreckage and hadn't been removed by the pilot. And I've encountered at least one pilot who told me that a CFI had told him not to remove the pin when he flies. Where this kind of bad information originates, I don't know. Fortunately, the overwhelming majority of pilots do remove the safety pin before flight, and we know that because in most accidents, the pin was correctly removed. The second procedural problem was that the pilot was landing at an airport that was IMC, and yet the pilot wasn't on an IFR flight plan, and he wasn't following either of the instrument approach procedures for the airport. Worse yet, the meteorological conditions that existed at the airport were below both the visibility and the altitude minimums for both of the available instrument approaches. So, for example, both approaches require 1 mile visibility, yet the visibility at the time was 1/4 of a mile. Now, why would a pilot attempt to land an aircraft under those conditions? Two things come to mind. One is that the doctor may have had appointments that he would miss if he didn't land the airplane at the airport. And the other relates to his background as a Navy SEAL. I live in Silicon Valley, and we have a lot of Type A personalities who have been successful through sheer force of their will. And it wouldn't be surprising if Navy SEAL training leads SEALs to try to overcome all obstacles in their paths in other parts of their lives as well. Like so many accidents, we know the what of what happened, but we're left wondering about the bigger question, which is the why. Why would a well-trained pilot attempt such a seemingly impossible landing? And of course, we'll never know. But what we should take away from this and the police helicopter accident is that our goal as a pilot should never be to land at a particular airport. Instead, our goal should be to make a safe landing somewhere, even if it's not our original intended destination. If you have feedback or insight about any of these accidents you'd like to share, go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and send me an email. And I'll read some of your emails on a future show. And this is, of course, a listener-supported show, so we always look for your feedback and suggestion for future shows. And you can help us grow the show by forwarding this episode to one or two friends who you feel might benefit from it, and then encourage them to click on follow or subscribe so they'll get the new episodes released each week. And I'd also like to invite you to become a member and join our club to support Aviation News Talk. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, choose the dollar amount you'd like to pledge to support the show. And at the same time, you can read about the things that you'll get at the different dollar levels. Or you can make a one-time donation at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down. You can always